Thanks for allowing me to be with you this morning. I like the notion that we can do better. I actually think we will do better. Lots of moving pieces out there. We're going to be in the middle of healthcare reform for the next decade, but it's kind of interesting watching the discussion on the national level. In some communities, they're noticing that public policy decisions by their state officials have made it impossible for some people to get access to health care because they're too poor. Some states have made it illegal for state employees to tell people what they're entitled to under the Affordable Care Act. And the national discussion continues to be sort of muddled about the best healthcare system in the world for some people. It continues to vex me that policymakers have a difficulty getting their arms around the notion that we pay twice as much as most industrialized country for the best healthcare system in the world, where the average American gets sick more often, they take longer to get well, and they die sooner than those other inferior systems. But I think slowly but surely we're watching people assert their right to health care and to a system that works better. The Affordable Care Act is, a C+, and it was the best we could do with the absolute collapse of the legislative process in the Senate back in the day. But it's an important start. Another important start for giving people quality health care deals with what we are doing with our agricultural policy. And I would like to just rant about this for maybe about 12 minutes, maybe 15 at most, and then perhaps engage in a conversation about this with you. Because you may have heard part of the exciting debate was how we're lavishing too much support on poor people through food stamps, creating part of what my friend Paul Ryan refers to a safety net that's turned into a comfortable hammock. I don't know how many of those people regard a comfortable habit trying to exist on food stamp budgets, but that got in the way of a more rational and thoughtful discussion and obscured some of the big picture. The point is that we are paying too much to the wrong people to grow the wrong things in the wrong places. We are subsidizing food that makes Americans sick. And we make it hard for people to get access to the bounty of this country. A bounty that is produced at great cost to the taxpayer, damage to the environment, and abusing animal welfare. I voted against the last Farm Bill, although there are some marginal improvements. I would rate it probably only about a D+. And for Oregon farmers and ranchers, there were some improvements. In Oregon, you see, we grow what's called food. But in the nomenclature of federal agricultural policy, those are specialty crops. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, berries, But we've gotten some marginal improvements there. But this $1 trillion farm bill, the best we could do was provide $16.5 billion in budget savings over the next decade. And most of those savings were cuts to nutrition and conservation. There was controversy around SNAP, food stamps, concerned about undeserving people receiving it, fraud. This bill got rid of direct payments that were absolutely inexcusable, but then they've plussed up crop insurance. And it may well be that it's going to end up costing us more in the future because of the way they calibrated it. Crop insurance has a rate of fraud twice as high as food stamps, and somehow was not worthy of special focus and attention. But I think for a moment, some of you who've been involved with the effort to reform the Farm Bill ought to feel good that there's almost $1 billion over the next 5 years for research and technical assistance. Farmers and ranchers in Oregon are not so much interested in being on the dole. They would like the federal government to invest in innovation, in research, in market access, disease protection, things that should be the federal role. There has been some progress in the farmers market and local food promotion program that, as you know, promotes access to fresh fruits and vegetables in underserved communities. A big jump to be funded at $150 million over 5 years. That's the amount of money that the federal government is going to pay to Brazilian cotton farmers because we refuse to reduce unlawful subsidies that we have to American cotton farmers. And so we've agreed to pay $150 million to the Brazilian cotton industry. We have an opportunity to deal with investments in conservation, something that benefits all of us with improved water quality, water quantity, wildlife habitat. We've got some improvements in conservation compliance to improve standards, innovative stewardship, particularly on fragile farmland. But it's a baby step. And it's an area where I would hope that some of you might be willing to invest a little time and energy to think about it and maybe help promote, because conservation ought to be an area that we can drive a wedge into this discussion to have broader benefit to the Farm Bill. This is the Hook and Bullet Club, right? These are our friends who hunt and fish, who are bird watchers. It's an interesting constituency that could be added to this overall movement to make the system work better. Basically, we need to have a farm bill that works for Oregon. 90%, almost 90% of Oregon farmers and ranchers don't get anything out of the Farm Bill. And we continue to lavish the bulk of the subsidies to 6 states that produce 10 commodities, most of which the world has enough of. It's why we have an area the size of the state of New York planted in corn, and has produced a dead zone in the mouth of the Mississippi River about the size of Delaware. These are areas that can and should be modified to be able to put the emphasis on small and medium-sized production, on things that respect animal welfare, not confined animal feedlots, not industrial production of commodities, not subsidizing farmers to the extent that they will pull fragile land out of conservation and plant it even though they know the crops will probably fail because they will make so much from crop insurance that it pays them to do that. And you are paying them to undercut the conservation area. My friend Michael Pollan says there's a reason why a bunch of carrots costs more than a package of Twinkies. Because of the way the federal subsidized system works for commodities. It's time for us to decide that's no longer acceptable. That this is an initiative that ought to take place in every community, to think about what a farm bill would look like for Oregon, look what a farm bill would look like for Oregon's wine industry, what a farm bill would look like for your school district. We've got to turn this thing on its head. There is a vast coalition that is ready to be mobilized. For some of our amendments to try and limit payments or improve conservation, we were joined by very conservative think tanks, by do-good, mushy-headed liberals, by people who are involved in the organic space, people who care about child nutrition, people who are concerned about the epidemic of food insecurity in this country. Editorial pages from the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and everything in between could agree that we can do better for America's farmers and ranchers, for the taxpayer, and for the part of the American public that eats. This is not the biggest challenge, perhaps, that we face on a global scale. Some are deeply concerned about that which cannot be named in Congress, global warming and climate change. But agricultural policy is a part of that discussion as well. We're watching declining snowpack, extreme weather events, degradation of farm land. We're watching what happens with inappropriate agricultural models that result in carbon release rather than carbon capture. I could go on at great length to talk about how virtually every issue of the day, from health to our kids to climate change, is touched by our flawed agricultural policy. We need your help in having people pick a part of this equation that matters to them. There ought to be a permanent farmers market in every community, large and small, across the country. We ought to make it easy for beginning farmers to get started, have access to credit, to be trained. We ought to make sure that those who are attempting to have humane treatment of farm animals are not undercut by industrial models that get subsidization, pollute the air and water, and produce food that is, shall we say, questionable in nature. Anybody who cares about public health ought to be concerned that we are slowly medicating the American population with the extreme abuse of antibiotics that have no therapeutic use. Help maybe accelerate growth a little bit, but growth of superbugs that threaten the health of every one of your family members. We ought to make it a priority to help everyone understand a little bit of what they can do. Something to be not just concerned about, but maybe upset about. Whether it is protection of your tax dollars to prevent the abuse of crop insurance, or it's to make sure that we have sound programs that deal with nutritional security for our families, that don't become a political football, but supplement the amazing work that is done by food bank, churches, private charities. But they can't do this alone. It's not their job to assume the role of the federal government. It's a partnership, and we need to strengthen it. I really appreciate the follow-through on this conference, that you're making an investment in terms of how we can do better, because we can. This country of ours is still the richest, most powerful nation in the world. But somehow we're at risk of having the nation of yes, we can be the country of no, we can't. That we don't have the will or the intellect to somehow craft conservation policies that benefit most users and not subsidize an industrialized model. That we don't have to make it cheaper to provide food that makes our families sicker and then cause more problems down the line. Or just simply the celebration of food. I love what's going on in school programs that start with a school garden, teach kids about food, how to prepare it, how to enjoy it. I've had several parents now from these programs tell me how their kids have taught them to like Brussels sprouts. What a moment. What a moment. The celebration of the fundamental nutrition, not just of the body, but of the community and of the spirit. I think that's part of this broader equation. And it's something that I hope that you will be, some of you at least, will be willing to work with me now, getting ready for the next farm bill, mobilizing the majority of Americans who agree with us, and then fighting to make sure that the D-plus farm bill we got doesn't get undercut in the meat grinder of the legislative process in Congress. Well, I appreciate the chance to share some of my biases with you. My rant is over, but I get a little excited about this because I think it is something that can really bring us together in ways that can have a transformative effect. And because of the work that so many people have done in Portland now, centered around sustainable agriculture, around the food movement, around food education, Portland's already a better place. You know, if you're not careful, you'll trip over another New York Times restaurant reviewer, right? I mean, and everything from food carts to community gardens, there's a lot going on that we should feel good about. But only feel good for about 39 seconds. And think from there how we build on that platform, how we get more people involved, how we spread the word and the model so that you get a farm bill that you deserve and that America needs. Thank you very much. Now, if I haven't already exhausted your time and patience, I would be interested if there are thoughts and observations. They don't have to be questions, they can be, but if any of this makes any sense or what's on. And I'm told that, not I'm told, I can see there are not one but two microphones so that everybody can hear the question or comment. And if you could tell me who you are and if you represent some subversive group.
Thank you, Earl. I'm John Booker. I'm a member of several groups in the Corvallis-Benton County area. I'm up from that area. And my question, I work with the BCCRC. We are doing a GMO or natural foods thing in our county, and my concern is the GMOs and the effect that they're having on our food system, and we would like to see it banned in Oregon, and I'd like to see them at least curtail it because those foods are not healthy. The statistically, processed food has been proven by science to be not healthy for you, and we shouldn't be encouraging and pushing these things. What would you do, Earl, to stop the tide of GMOs?
Well, the first thing we need to do is have that transparency that people talk about. People have a right to know what they're buying. I am a strong believer in market forces. I'm also a strong believer in individuals being able to have control over what they are buying. And I think first and foremost, everybody who's concerned about this ought to unite to make sure that we have truth in labeling. And frankly, if I were advising the folks in the GMO sector, I'd suggest this is not a fight you want to have. Because if GMOs are as benign and harmless as you say, why shouldn't people know if they get it? And it raises suspicion when they pour millions of dollars into campaign to prevent people from knowing what they are getting. That's wrong. And I don't think people should accept that. Another area that I am working on now deals with some of the negotiations that are going on. For example, there's a notion of having a trade agreement with the European Union. You know, we're a region that is very dependent on international trade. We don't use all those Intel chips just in Oregon. They're part of a global market. And we export food around the world. And we have people who are involved with footwear and apparel and a whole range of things, that machinery, that create lots of good jobs here. But I am reluctant to see negotiations with Europe, for example, where somehow we're going to force them to accept our regime on GMO, you know, just sort of force them to undercut their protections and research. I think these are areas that we ought to be able to live and let live, to respect the differences. We ought to be able to make sure that we have areas that are free of genetically modified crops. We have a burgeoning organics industry here. We create lots of seed in the Willamette. We can grow almost anything in the Willamette Valley. And if we're not careful, we're going to undercut that market advantage and not be able to sell them around the world. So I think we ought to start with some basics. Transparency, letting people know what they get, and being able to protect some of our local industries that are absolutely dependent on having pure strains of product and seed. I think that'd be a place to start.
Hi, I'm Chris Allman. I work with a couple activist groups, Physicians for National Health Program, Oregon Save Our Schools. I'm a physician activist. I really appreciate your nuanced answer to this previous question. I just wanted to let people know that there is the Oregon Right to Know campaign, yes, on 5/22, which is starting to get the labeling out here in Oregon. It's not just the fact that we don't even know how to identify whether food allergies are contributing to many of our medical ailments, to genetically engineered seeds, but it's also the fact that these herbicides are getting into our water and changing our ecosystems. So I just wanted to point that out. Now, I have a question for you on a different topic. Single payer. Never was at the table in 2008 and preceding that. Michael Dembrow has been the champion on this issue, and we're trying to really look at this question, wanted to get money to look at a study which didn't get funded, requiring at least $200,000 to look at this and study it here in the state of Oregon. What do you think about that, and how could we move forward nationally into really looking at single-payer financing?
Well, welcome to my world. You know, it was very interesting when we were dealing with the Affordable Care Act. I had some people having a die-in because it wasn't single-payer. And I had Tea Party people with pitchforks because we were going to be upsetting the balance of nature and wrecking the finest healthcare system in the world by extending healthcare insurance to more people. This Congress has been dominated. I'm on the health subcommittee. I'd like to do some work on health. We've spent all our time on 53 votes to repeal Obamacare. One of the things that I hope comes out of this broadened debate is for us to be able to look at what our choices really are, how they work. If we could have, for example, extended Medicare to more people, would have been less complex. I mean, the whole rollout problems are part of the fact that we've made it more complex. But I think the path that we're on, that we had no alternative to get anything passed other than something that was similar to what was enacted. And I think the energy ought to be directed towards making it work. That we ought to be able to refine that, to be able to build on the pilot projects, to be able to draw a distinction, because there's a controlled scientific experiment going on now. Half the states have refused to expand Medicaid despite essentially free federal money, creating 5 million Americans who are too poor to qualify for any assistance for health care, despite the fact that they come from states that tend to be less healthy and with a higher rate of an uninsured population. I think what we're needing to be doing right now is to deal with what we've got, to improve it, to hold people accountable, to find ways to squeeze more value out of the health care system, to promote more public understanding. I mean, it is amazing people who are opposed to Obamacare and love almost all the features. You know? Nobody is going to be kicked off a health care plan because they get sick. Wow. Pre-existing conditions. You know, about 80% of the people in Congress are uninsurable. And they have pre-existing conditions. And I'm not even talking about mental state. But the public has a huge disconnect. And I hope that we can use this as an opportunity to help people understand what we've got, understand the problems, understand the opportunities, squeeze some of the most grotesque inefficiencies out of the system, and use it for us to be able to deal step by step to make fundamental changes that don't cost anything and promote more understanding. Because I will tell you, having been, well, one little example. I'm the death panel guy, right? Right? I had legislation that I put into the Affordable Care Act in the House that would have paid for the family of a 96-year-old woman with terminal cancer who's going to get a hip replacement to pay $150 so they know what they're facing, what their circumstances are, what their choices are. And that morphed into death panels. 20% of the American public still think death panels are in the bill. We've got a long way to go to be able to have a basis of public understanding and support so that we can get to a point where there's more fundamental reforms. And that is one that ought to be considered. But I'll tell you, until we get the foundation, until we build on what we've got, I don't want to get bogged down in hand-to-hand warfare over something that has no chance of passing over the next 10 years, when we have something that has an opportunity to make a profound difference for millions of Americans, and there are incremental steps we can take to move it further. So follow your passion. And if what people want is single payer and that's all they want to work on, that's cool. But I'm going to be working to implement this bill and to look for ways to build upon it, to improve it, and to have the public understanding of our healthcare system so that we can have more dramatic reforms in the future.
Thank you, Representative Blumenauer, for being my representative in Congress. I'm Jim Gaudino. I'm a physician and public health practitioner, and I've done a lot of work with the Oregon Public Health Association as well as the American Public Health Association. So I want to turn a little attention to public health. Most of health happens outside the clinic and the hospital. Yet in Oregon, about 90% of the public health infrastructure is funded by the federal government. A recent report came out that from the group of a national group whose name NACCHO, that about 15% of public health workers in the United States, of their jobs, have gone away since 2008. The Affordable Care Act is now in debate in Congress. Full funding for the Affordable Care Act has not happened, yet a lot of important public health funding that goes to states and local health departments and communities are wrapped up in the Affordable Care Act. So we're kind of in a real big bind. I know that in Oregon, the CCOs are directed by state statute to get into population medicine and community health issues as well. Could you talk about what we can do, what's happening in Congress, how we can advocate more for public health and community health, as well as coverage for those that need it?
Well, I'm hopeful that, I can't imagine how many listservs are represented in this room. I mean it. In terms of professional organizations, religious affiliations, civic groups, alumni. So, you're connected in this room conservatively to probably 10 million people. We've got to make these priorities something that extends beyond sort of the immediate folks that we deal with. And we need to have people understand that they need to be developing networks and holding people accountable. I get a little tired of having people come in and tell me they agree with me in Washington, D.C. Okay, that's cool, But you shouldn't be taking my time or your time to say, yeah, you kind of like what I've done. What are we going to do to deal with people who don't agree with us? There ought to be at least as much energy directed towards people who are trying to underfund or defund the Affordable Care Act. And people in their districts, companies, universities, churches, professional organizations. There's a lot on the line. And we ought to be reaching out to make those connections to other people around the country. It's going to be a brutal effort to get the minimal funding. We embedded as much as we could into the law to be automatic, and you've seen a systematic effort to try and chip away at that. if the control of the United States Senate changes to some of my Tea Party friends, it's going to be even tougher. But I think ultimately what's going to make a difference is being able to take this control process that I was talking about, the difference between what's going on, thank you very much, in Mississippi and Missouri and Georgia and Texas, and what's happening in Oregon and Washington and California and Connecticut and New York, and drive that stuff home. I hate to say it, but I think people need to take the political process seriously. Because the people who disagree with you take it very seriously. And they have a simpler message, and they tend to get charged up more. Now, I don't suggest anybody here ought to do anything crazy. And I know you wouldn't give the equivalent statement that you just gotta love, where they're saying, keep the government's hands off my Medicare. You wouldn't fall into those logical fallacies. But a little more energy, a little more direct accountability. Groups and organizations, unions, companies that have a stake in the success of this law, and that's a lot, need to be heard from. Yeah, need to be heard from.
Senator, I'm over here on the wall. I'm hugging the wall. I'm Karen Stolzberg. I'm on the planning committee for this conference. I'm also a Social Security disability lawyer here in Portland. I just wanted to mention to those of you who mentioned Senator Dembro that he will be here this afternoon talking about his bill trying to get funding to study the single payer. I find your comments regarding what we do in Oregon and how that can influence policy eventually very inspiring. It's something that I often lose heart about. I'm very concerned, however, about the large money interests that seem to control our input, what the input into our local policy initiatives are. I worked on a GMO labeling bill probably 15 years ago, where starting then and continuing, the big money came in with the TV ads talking about how it was going to hurt the family farmers. I see that continuing all over. We now have all these U.S. Supreme Court decisions that are allowing large donors to exert undue influence on process and there's no truth in advertising requirement in terms of political advertising. What can happen from the top down to allow the bottom up to be more effective?
Well, you're not going to outspend Monsanto or the tobacco industry. Okay, that's an accepted fact. And given this Supreme Court and the people who control the House of Representatives, there's nothing that's going to pass Congress in the short term on this. But that is not to say I feel that we are powerless. I think part of what I hope the circumstances encourage us to do is to go back and deal with some of the fundamentals. There should be a farm organization that represents most Oregon farmers and ranchers, not just the largest interests. They have not been well served, in my judgment, and there needs to be more interaction with most farmers and ranchers to talk about what their stake is, for example, in a farm bill for Oregon. The work that we can do with subsets of industries, like the wine industry, the nursery industry. There are many common interests that we need to build upon. I don't think there's any substitution for taking these networks, trying to expand them, and to let people know what difference it makes to them. But if we take what's happening with school nutrition programs that are more directed towards the health and the local agricultural product, if we expand upon the farmers market movement and the people who participate in it, if we deal with the advocates who care about hunger in Oregon, if we deal with those who are deeply concerned, pick one, diabetes, there are opportunities for us to coalesce, to inform, and to mobilize support. And I will tell you, if we do a better job of raising the profile of what's important about some of this, we can actually influence some of the commercial interests, because they don't want to really be on the wrong side of most consumers. Have you watched what's happened with the cereal companies? They had buried in the fine print of some of their proposals that disputes would be settled via arbitration, and just to try and prevent being sued. And they just buried some fine print. Well, that industry kind of figured out that that's not really a very popular position with the general public. And they actually changed their position, not because they needed to legally, but because they were getting on the wrong side of the court of public opinion. I think there's more that we can do in the court of public opinion. I mean, I think the whole antibiotic abuse is an area that is, I think, ripe for major organizational effort and change. But I don't think that in the short term there's going to be any substitute for our finding other ways to communicate. And this is a tough climate. This is a tough climate to communicate in, but a lot of you are tweeting and Facebooking, and you don't have to rely on just commercial television. We don't actually have a newspaper here anymore. But there are things you can do with your own networks. And I don't think, I mean, it's not easy and it's not a comfortable thing to say, but I think it's important, and I think that's what we have to do.